typical model of traditional strength and power training I have discovered is not enough. I thought it was not enough for a long time, and now I actually have the data to back that up, based on my time in Japan, and based on that data and me exploring different influences, the people I spoke about in the list. um, I think the traditional up and down strength and power training, let's do squats and power cleans, is a job half done. And what we're going to talk about once we've hopefully demonstrated that is only half a job done is the theoretical and practical considerations that have to come into play of what are we going to do about the other 50%. And I'm going to try and put that together into the newer model of strength and power development that I'm using with my athletes, and to explain that progression, and how hopefully all the pieces fit together, and give you some examples of how you can do that with your own athletes. So the biomechanical basis for traditional strength and power training is a fairly simple one. We know that we want to run faster, jump higher, hit harder, and so on, and that requires a change in momentum. And change in momentum is equal to impulse, which is equal to force multiplied by time. And we know from research that the contact times available to apply force in sporting skills do not change whether we are elite or sub-elite, whether we are female or male. They're fairly consistent between all of those different conditions. So if time is not going to change, the only option we're left with to increase impulse is to increase the force applied against the source of resistance. And as I've said in a number of different presentations and writings and podcasts, is that success leaves clues, and humans will always figure out a way to do something fairly well over time just by trial and error. And we know that heavy strength training increases maximal force production because it's right there in front of our eyes. When we lift heavy weights, we get better at lifting heavy weights, and obviously heavier weights provide more resistance, and if we can overcome that, we must be applying more force against that source of resistance. So around the same time, a little bit earlier, I think it was just before I'd moved to Japan, I'd finished reading Franz Bosch's book on strength and conditioning. Kind of, I think people would call it a coordination-based approach to strength and conditioning. I think the disappointing thing about what Franz Bosch does is there's a degree of intellectual arrogance, whereby it's his way or the highway. I think some of his ideas are absolutely not on this planet. And if you serve people delicious icing on a cake made of dog crap, the cake is still unpalatable. So I think he has a real point about some stuff, and then other stuff, it just makes it difficult to swallow because of how it's delivered. But if you can be mature in how you interpret his book, there are some concepts that you can take away from that book and make sense in the context of the data that I mentioned here, and thinking about the reality of sporting action. And one of these is the concept of muscle slack. And that is the idea that before muscles can create movement, and the tendon can transfer force to the bones, which the joints then obviously transfer force to the floor or the implement, is that there's a degree of slack in the muscle tendon unit, and the muscle must contract and remove this slack before creating tension on the tendon, which then creates that movement. This slack can impede performance, and if athletes are waiting to contact the ground or the implement before they get rid of this slack, not only are they going to leak energy, they're going to increase ground contact times and basically be ineffective. And you can look at standard sprint research to examine why this is going to be the case. So that was one concept that I took away from the book. What Dr. McGill found is that he calls it the paradox of muscle contraction. He says that muscular force is required to initiate movement, and that's what's needed, obviously, because we need movement to create impulse change. But also the problem is that muscular force actually creates stiffness and slows motion down. So to get around this paradox, and he validated this in the EMG, is that athletes, they create pulses of force. So to create that initial movement and accelerate the limb, there is a massive pulse of force at the beginning of the motion. And then the athlete actually quickly relaxes until the point of contact, whereby there is a massive isometric pulse of force again to try and create what is called the greatest possible effective mass. So the phrase that he uses, you can't push a rope, but you can push a rock. And if you're trying to transfer energy and create the biggest force possible, you want to be more like a rock rather than a rope. So when we throw a kick into an opponent, we can't be relaxed and just allow the leg to become deformed. We actually want the body to be as stiff as humanly possible to try and impart the whole mass of the body plus the energy of the limb into the opponent at once. And he said that basically the objective in collision sports is to try and maximize the effective mass. But this got me thinking, effectively all sports are collision sports, because if we're not colliding with an opponent or with an implement or the ball, we're just colliding with the floor when we sprint. So this got me thinking about that double force pulsing. When you view Peter Wayne's research of the double peak vertical force production, this is basically exactly the same thing. It is athletes creating a large amount of isometric force to create whole body tension and transfer the biggest amount of energy possible when it's required. And to quote his research, movement speed had very little to do with the total amount of muscular force, but a lot to do with the rate of muscle activation and relaxation. Elite performers like Georges St-Pierre were able to relax 6 times faster than graduate students who acted as the control group. And then lastly, we follow this up with the oscillatory isometrics. Again, on the right, this is not an exercise that I included, but same principles. Michael Leach performing for the hinge pattern of hamstrings. And you can see that as he's throwing the ball into the floor, there's a large amount of force created that he has to contract his hamstrings against to try and maintain the posture of the movement. As he lets go of the ball, he has to release that force, and then basically he's having to switch between contract, relax, producing those pulses of force. The example we see of the Chinese plank oscillatory isometric on the left is one I considered to be for glute development because of the angles associated and the lack of stress being placed on the hamstrings. Exactly the same principle though, maintain that body position, resist the deformation from your partner with pulses of force, switch on, switch off. Now as we come to power variations, you can see these are basic bodyweight variations, admittedly with a little bit more resistance in the example of Alex Lundberg performing squat jumps on the right, but in this phase, the intensity is almost a secondary concern. We're more interested in the technique, extension, development of work capacity, and earning the right to use non-counter variations like we're seeing here in phase 2. The example on the left, Nico performing banded step-ups, the reason that we used a unilateral variation was that he was rehabbing a hamstring tear on his left leg at the time, so we decided to do what we could to concentrate on the right leg. This is not to say that you can't use these variations with a healthy athlete. You're welcome to use whatever you want, but just for the interest of time management, I tend to use a bilateral variation like you're seeing Richard Kahu here performing on the right.